Brothers and sisters, on the morning of the 18th of September, in the year 2025, history cracked open. In a landlocked nation where the dust of the Sahel has long whispered of poverty and abandonment, a steel leviathan rose from the waters. A Russian nuclear submarine, Kazan, surfaced not on the Atlantic coast, but in the very heart of Burkina Faso. 1,200 kilometers inland, where no ocean was ever meant to reach. What the world once called impossible had been made real. Through sweat, stone, and sovereignty, the Sahel Atlantic Canal was carved like a scar across the earth, a lifeline connecting a forgotten people to the sea. And as that submarine cut the waters of Port Traoré, the voice of Africa thundered, "We will not be bound by geography, nor by chains unseen." This is more than military maneuvers. This is prophecy fulfilled, the day when landlocked became limitless, when the Sahel States lifted their banner and declared, "Africa shall sail her own ships." Stay with us, my beloved community. And before we journey deeper, I ask you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, so together we may walk through the storm of history and witness the dawn of a new Africa. Brothers and sisters, let us return to that morning, the 18th of September 2025. The air above the Sahel was still. Farmers were tending to fields of millet and sorghum. Children in dusty villages were preparing their lessons, some barefoot, some hungry. And yet, beneath the earth, in waters where no child of Africa had ever dreamed of a navy, a shadow was moving. At 6 o'clock sharp, Greenwich Mean Time, the water broke, rising like a beast from myth. The Russian nuclear submarine Kazan surfaced in the Port Traoré naval base. It was not the ocean. It was not a distant harbor by the coast. It was a man-made channel, a carved artery of sovereignty, stretching 420 kilometers from the plateau of Burkina Faso to the Atlantic Ocean. People watched in disbelief. A submarine of 13,800 tons, 139 meters in length, glided silently into a port built in secret, in sacrifice, and in speed. Kazan, a vessel with unlimited underwater endurance, armed with cruise missiles, torpedoes, and the silent strength of 64 officers, had come not to conquer, but to inaugurate. That day, the alliance of Sahel States Confederate Navy was born. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, three nations once mocked as landlocked, dismissed as too poor, too weak, too dependent, now stood together with frigates, patrol boats, helicopters, amphibious aircraft, and above all, the Kazan. The value of the fleet, $2.8 billion. But the value of its meaning? Priceless. For the first time in history, the desert had touched the sea. Captain Traoré, voice steady yet burning with fire, declared before his people, "Today, landlocked Burkina Faso becomes a naval power. This proves that African determination, combined with true partnership, can achieve the impossible." Brothers and sisters, hear the weight of those words. For centuries, Africa was told what it could not do. You cannot build without Western finance. You cannot defend without Western armies. You cannot sail without Western permission. But on that September morning, a canal stood where there had only been earth and rock. 17 locks had tamed the rise and fall of the plateau. 89,000 laborers had sweated in dust and heat. 12 massive tunnel-boring machines had cut through granite, like Moses parting the sea. 18 months of relentless work, funded by alliances with Russia and China, powered by the hands of Africans themselves, had produced what Western voices called madness. And yet, there it was. Water, where no water should flow. The Sahel Atlantic Canal was more than engineering. It was testimony. It was the cry of nations long strangled by geography, telling the world, our future is not bound by borders drawn in colonial ink. And in the heart of that canal stood Port Traoré Naval Base, 45 square kilometers of steel and concrete, with submarine pens, missile bunkers, dry docks for shipbuilding, helicopter pads, underground storage, and 12,000 personnel. It was no token facility. It was a fortress, a statement, a living defiance. Let us not forget, beloved, that Burkina Faso was once a name many could not even place on a map. It was dismissed as one of the poorest of the poor, stripped of gold, drained of cotton, ignored by global trade. And yet, in a single unveiling, it became the center of the most audacious naval project since the Suez Canal. The newspapers of the West called it impossible, unthinkable, madness. But the people of the Sahel called it destiny. For as the Kazan lay in the waters of Port Traoré, as frigates named Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba prepared their decks, as patrol boats and helicopters stood ready, a new doctrine was spoken. Protect Sahel trade routes. Prevent foreign blockades. Coordinate with allies who respect African sovereignty. And above all, project African power in African waters. Not tomorrow, not in dreams, but now. This was the day landlocked became limitless, the day the children of the Sahel saw a submarine and believed their continent could do the unthinkable. But brothers and sisters, every miracle carries a cost. Every triumph stirs fear in the halls of power. For even as Kazan floated proudly in her new harbor, far away in Washington, in Paris, in London, alarms were sounding. The question that trembled across the Atlantic was not how Africa had done it, but how the world would respond. Brothers and sisters, no sooner had the submarine Kazan risen from the waters of Port Traoré than the world shook, not in celebration, but in alarm. For what Africa saw as deliverance, the West saw as danger. In Washington, the Pentagon called an emergency briefing. The United States Secretary of Defense, Face Stern, declared, "A Russian nuclear submarine in West African waters represents a fundamental threat to Atlantic security and freedom of navigation." In Paris, the French Minister of Defense clenched his fists. This development threatens regional stability and requires a coordinated response. And in London, the Royal Navy warned, "Submarine capability in hostile hands creates unacceptable risks for British shipping." Do you hear it, beloved? Do you feel the trembling? For centuries, Africa's weakness meant Western calm. But the moment Africa stood strong, Western voices broke into panic. NATO, that grand alliance of the North Atlantic, convened an emergency session on that very day. 18th September 2025. Plans were drafted, strategies whispered, and within hours, Western warships shifted course. The United States Sixth Fleet began deployment closer to West Africa. French patrols in the Gulf of Guinea doubled. British surveillance aircraft soared over the Atlantic skies. Fear had been awakened. Not fear of aggression, but fear of independence. Yet Africa was not silent. From Johannesburg to Algiers, from Addis Ababa to Dar es Salaam, voices rose in celebration. South Africa hailed the Sahel achievement as a triumph of African ingenuity. Algeria declared, "This shows how determination can overcome geography." Ethiopia proclaimed, "African maritime power strengthens continental security." Tanzania called upon all to rejoice in African independence at sea. But not all were singing. Nigeria, the giant of the region, raised eyebrows and muttered warnings. "We are monitoring developments to protect our interests." Ghana spoke cautiously of the need for coordination to maintain stability. Ivory Coast pleaded for dialogue, anxious that the new canal would sideline its own ports. Do you see, my brothers and sisters, the fault lines forming? Some nations rejoiced, others worried, and still others walked the tightrope of neutrality. Kenya said simply, "All nations have the right to defend themselves." Morocco insisted, "Naval development must build collective security, not tension." Egypt reminded all, "Power must remain bound by international law." This was no longer about a submarine. This was about sovereignty, about who holds the right to sail, who holds the right to command the seas. And standing at the center of the storm was a young man, Ibrahim Traoré. 34 years old, no dynasty behind him, no golden inheritance, only the weight of his people's hope on his shoulders. He looked at the foreign envoys, at the diplomats whispering of sanctions, and he said with clarity, "Africa has gold, Africa has oil, Africa has diamonds, yet Africa remains the poorest continent. That is no accident. That is design. And today we refuse to live as puppets on another man's strings." Those words echoed not only in Ouagadougou, but across the continent. They were not spoken in anger, but in truth. And truth has a way of silencing even the proud. But, beloved, let us not forget the hidden battle, the war not of ships, but of stories. Even as the Kazan rested in its dock, Western networks spread reports calling it propaganda, a fantasy, a fabrication. Artificial intelligence was deployed to flood social media with images of collapse, corruption, and chaos. They said the canal was unsustainable, the fleet a hollow showpiece, the alliance nothing but a puppet of Moscow and Beijing. Yet on the ground, in the dust of Burkina Faso, men and women touched the steel of the frigates, saw the water flowing where once there was only sand, and knew that reality could not be erased by lies. Chinese engineers, who had sweated alongside African laborers, testified, "We built this together." Russian officers training Sahel cadets declared, "This is no illusion." The truth stood, but the storm was rising. Sanctions were threatened, loans were withdrawn, Western embassies whispered of blockades. The alliance of Sahel States faced not only fleets at sea, but the crushing weight of economic retaliation. Brothers and sisters, we must ask, what is the price of freedom? For the Sahel, the price was already clear: the risk of isolation, the danger of confrontation, the possibility of war. And yet in that moment, with the eyes of the world upon them, Ibrahim Traoré and his admirals did not flinch. They lifted their voices and declared, "Africa will protect its waters. Africa will protect its trade. Africa will protect its dignity." The world may have heard panic in Western capitals, but in the villages of Burkina Faso, in the deserts of Mali, in the markets of Niger, the sound was not fear. It was celebration. But brothers and sisters, let us not deceive ourselves. Celebration is only the beginning. For when a new power rises, consequences follow. The question is not whether the world will react, but how heavy the consequences will be. Brothers and sisters, every stone cast into the water makes ripples. And when the stone is as heavy as a nuclear submarine surfacing in Burkina Faso, the ripples become waves that touch every shore. The Sahel Atlantic Canal did not only bring steel and warships, it brought commerce. It brought the chance for a people long dependent on others to walk their own path. For the first time, goods from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger could move directly to the Atlantic without begging permission from coastal neighbors. Gold, cotton, grain, and uranium now had a passage to the world, free from the tolls and tariffs that had drained them for decades. Economists calculated quickly, $340 million in transit fees annually, $180 million more in port operations, jobs for 34,000 men and women. $810 million in fresh revenue flowing each year into Sahel coffers for nations long labeled poor, landlocked, and hopeless. This was nothing less than resurrection. And yet, beloved, resurrection always stirs resistance. Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Nigeria saw trade routes slipping from their fingers. They saw revenue drying from their ports. Their worry was not just security, it was survival. A canal that gave the Sahel life could drain their treasuries dry. In Ouagadougou, pride soared. Ibrahim Traoré walked among his people not in pomp, but in the simple uniform of a soldier. He reminded them, independence is not a slogan. Independence is when your gold stays your gold, when your crops feed your children, when your ships sail under your own flag. The people roared in answer, waving their flags, chanting his name. For them, the canal was not simply water. It was dignity flowing again after centuries of drought. But, my brothers and sisters, let us be honest. Dignity has a price. Within weeks, Western banks froze accounts. Loans were suspended. Insurance for Sahel shipping was revoked. Pressure grew on regional allies to isolate the canal, to deny recognition of the new navy, to close skies and borders. What began as celebration quickly carried the weight of sanctions. Mothers in the markets asked quietly, "If the West closes its doors, will our children still eat?" Traders in the towns whispered, "If ships will not insure us, can our goods still reach the sea?" Even as pride burned bright, shadows crept into daily life. And yet, in the midst of doubt, a deeper truth emerged. For generations, Africa had lived with dependency on Western ports, on Western currencies, on Western armies. And what had dependency produced? Poverty, debt, disappointment. Perhaps then hardship under independence was no worse than hardship under control. For at least the hardship of independence was hardship chosen, not hardship imposed. Do you feel the weight of that, beloved? To suffer in freedom is different from suffering in chains. The international community grew restless. At the United Nations, debates raged. Some diplomats demanded sanctions, others pleaded for dialogue. China and Russia stood firm beside the Sahel, promising investment, promising protection. Western envoys warned of instability, of chaos, and in the middle, the voice of Africa spoke again. We will not return to bondage. We have touched the sea, and we will not retreat. But the consequences were not only in money or in diplomacy, they were in hearts. Young Africans looked at Ibrahim Traoré and saw more than a president. They saw possibility. They saw a man, only 34 years old, who spoke plainly, who lived simply, who carried himself not as a ruler but as a servant. And they asked themselves, if he can, why not us? If Burkina Faso can, why not the whole of Africa? My beloved community. The greatest ripple of that submarine was not in the halls of NATO nor in the banks of Paris. It was in the minds of Africans who began to believe again. But with belief comes burden, for hope must be fed and dreams must be defended. If the Sahel fails under the weight of sanctions, then cynicism will return. If it succeeds, then a revolution of thought may sweep across the continent. And so, we stand at a crossroad. One path leads to glory, where Africa commands its seas, its resources, its destiny. The other path leads to ruin, where isolation and poverty deepen, and enemies point and say, "See, they could not stand without us." The choice is not only for Ibrahim Traoré, nor for Burkina Faso, nor even for the Sahel States. The choice belongs to Africa and indeed to all who watch. So I ask you, brothers and sisters, when the price of freedom rises, will Africa pay it, or will the weight of the world press her back into chains once more? Brothers and sisters, when a small nation shakes the world, the giants stir uneasily. In Washington, strategists drew maps of West Africa with trembling hands. To them, the Sahel Atlantic Canal was not an African achievement, but a Russian plot. They saw Kazan not as a training vessel, but as a dagger aimed at the Atlantic. They feared that missiles launched from Burkina Faso could strike Lagos, Abidjan, even European capitals. And so, the narrative was framed. This is not about Africa's independence. This is about Moscow's reach. In Paris, the wound cut deeper. For France, West Africa was not only history, it was habit. Military bases, economic ties, the CFA franc, all threads in a web spun since colonial times. And now, with one submarine, one canal, one young leader refusing to bow, the web was torn. The French press called it humiliation. Politicians muttered of betrayal. Some demanded retaliation. Others feared that too much pressure would only ignite more fire across Africa. In London, the Royal Navy spoke of risk. Insurance companies whispered of danger to trade. Investors watched nervously, unsure whether to pour capital into ports that might soon be sidelined by Port Traoré. But while the West argued, the East smiled. In Moscow, Kazan's arrival was hailed as proof of Russian engineering and partnership. In Beijing, headlines praised China's role in building the canal, presenting it as a model of win-win cooperation. In Tehran, in Caracas, in capitals often labeled pariah, there was applause. Africa had joined the multipolar chorus. And in the chambers of the United Nations, the struggle for narrative raged. Western diplomats urged sanctions, claiming that Africa was being dragged into great power rivalry. But African voices rose. We will not be punished for achieving the impossible. We will not be sanctioned for building our own future. The hall echoed with division, the old powers on one side, the rising voices on the other. Beloved, do you see what is happening? A submarine may float in African waters, but the battle is global. It is a contest between two visions of the 21st century. One vision clings to the old order, where Africa's place is at the mercy of outsiders. The other vision proclaims a new world, where Africa sails her own ships, speaks her own truth, and stands in her own dignity. And yet, questions remain. Will the United States commit more forces, risking confrontation? Will France tighten economic pressure, risking rebellion? Will Russia and China truly stand firm, or will they withdraw when the cost grows high? The world watches. But the next chapter will not be written in Washington, Paris, or Moscow. It will be written in Africa. The only question is, whose hand will hold the pen? Brothers and sisters, a submarine may mark a beginning, but it does not mark the end. For the road of destiny stretches long before the Sahel, and its stones are both sharp and shining. Already plans are drawn. By the year 2027, a second nuclear submarine is promised to sail through the canal. Shipyards in Port Traoré are laying foundations not only for frigates, but for destroyers. A naval aviation wing is envisioned with carrier-based aircraft to guard African skies. And on the horizon, a naval academy, an institution where young Africans will be trained not in the shadows of Paris or Washington, but under their own flag, on their own soil. This is the dream, that the Sahel States, once dismissed as weak and landlocked, shall not only defend themselves, but inspire a continental awakening. And at the center of this dream stands Ibrahim Traoré, 34 years of age, a man who once studied geology, a man who rose not by inheritance, but by conviction. To the world he is controversial, but to his people he is a symbol that Africa need not wait for saviors, that Africa can be her own salvation. But, beloved, the path ahead is not smooth. For every ship built, there will be sanctions. For every submarine launched, there will be whispers of war. For every victory, there will be attempts to erase it with propaganda, with pressure, with promises meant to weaken resolve. Yet history teaches us, those who endure prevail. Africa's seas are wide, and her spirit deeper still. If the Sahel holds its nerve, if it strengthens its alliances, if it feeds its people and builds its industry, then the fleet of today may be only the first chapter of a far greater story. Imagine it, my brothers and sisters. An Africa where no blockade can strangle her trade, where no foreign army dictates her defense, where no puppet strings control her leaders. Imagine an Africa where ships built in Ouagadougou sail proudly under African flags, where canals carved by African hands carry not only submarines, but dreams. That is the road ahead. It is a road filled with risk, yes, but it is also a road filled with promise. For the question that remains is this: will Africa walk that road with steady steps, or will the weight of the world force her to stumble? The answer, beloved, is not written yet. It waits in the choices of leaders and in the voices of the people. Brothers and sisters, on the 18th of September 2025, the impossible became reality. A Russian nuclear submarine surfaced not on the coast, but in landlocked Burkina Faso. A canal was carved where no river had ever flowed. A navy was born in the desert, and Africa's voice thundered once more upon the waters of the world. Yet beyond the steel, beyond the ships, beyond the billions in value, the true revolution is spiritual. It is the realization that Africa need not wait for permission. It is the proof that sovereignty is not granted. It is seized. It is built. It is lived. We have felt anger at centuries of exploitation. We have mourned the wasted years of dependency. But now, beloved, we stand at the dawn of hope. For if Burkina Faso, long dismissed as poor and powerless, can carve a canal to the sea, then what else might Africa achieve? If Ibrahim Traoré, a young man of only 34 years, can lift his people to believe again, then who among us can say that Africa's destiny is sealed? This is more than a navy. This is a parable of resilience, a sermon of sovereignty, a prophecy of possibility. And the message is clear. Africa shall rise, not as servant, but as sovereign. So I ask you, my beloved community, do you believe the alliance of Sahel States Navy is the first step toward a new age of Ibrahim Traoré-style leadership across Africa? Do you believe that the story of Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, is the story of a continent reclaiming its pride? If your heart says yes, then write it in the comments below. African naval power. Let the world know you believe. And before we part, let me ask you one more thing. Hit subscribe and ring that bell. Not for me, but for us. For this community, for this witness, for this journey we walk together. Every voice counts, every click echoes, every believer strengthens the movement. For the canal has been carved, the submarine has surfaced, and the journey has begun. Now the future of Africa sails forward, and the tide cannot be turned back.